My mother told me my wife wasn't family enough to join the annual vacation. But my brother's girlfriend of 3 weeks got a room with an ocean view. I booked a separate trip and my parents found out when their credit card alerts started blowing up. This whole situation actually started not long ago when my wife Claire and I visited my parents for a small Sunday dinner. It was supposed to be a simple family catch-up before the annual vacation, something we had done for years without much thought. But the moment we walked through the front door, I sensed an odd tension in the room, something subtle but unmistakably pointed. My mother, Diane, was overly cheerful in the way she usually got when she was trying to mask discomfort, and my father, Mark, avoided eye contact with Claire in a way that immediately made my stomach tighten. My younger brother Aaron showed up a few minutes later with a new woman on his arm, a tall blonde in a floral dress named Leela. He introduced her with a grin that made it clear he was still in the honeymoon phase of whatever whirlwind romance they were having. She had a bright, bubbly laugh and the kind of confident ease that made my parents instantly adore her. Before we even sat down to eat, they were asking her about her hobbies, her favorite vacation spots, and whether she preferred ocean or bay views. Claire sat next to me during dinner, quiet but attentive, smiling politely whenever someone addressed her. I could tell she noticed the sudden shift in energy, how everyone seemed to orbit around Leela like she was the guest of honor. It was surreal watching my mother lean in and tell Leela that our annual trip was the highlight of the year, describing the spacious rooms, the wraparound deck, the sunrise views like she was pitching a luxury timeshare. Meanwhile, Claire barely received a passing glance or a follow-up question to anything she contributed. It was strange, and I remember thinking that something was off, but I brushed it aside because I assumed my parents were just dazzled by novelty. By the end of the night, though the pattern was impossible to ignore, my parents asked Leela which bedroom she would prefer, whether she liked firm pillows or soft ones, if she preferred to be closer to the balcony or farther from the kitchen. They talked about guest room arrangements without acknowledging that Claire and I usually shared the ocean view room. My mom said something about how they were still finalizing who would go this year and how things might be a little different from last time. Claire tried to hide the hurt in her eyes, but I could feel it radiating off her as we walked to the car afterward. On the drive home, she finally voiced what I had already seen. She said it felt like she was fading into the background of a picture she was supposed to be standing in the center of. She said she did not know if she had done something wrong or if my parents just did not like her anymore, but either way she could feel the shift. I grabbed her hand and told her I did not think that was true, but I also knew that reassurance was flimsy when the evidence was sitting fresh in our memory. I told her we would talk to my parents if things got worse. I told her they would not exclude her. I told her she was reading too much into it. And then 2 days later, I woke up to the message that proved she was not imagining anything. The message where my mother wrote that Claire was not family enough to come on the trip. The message where she suggested I attend alone so things would not be awkward. The message where she casually mentioned that the rooms were already assigned and that they could not rearrange things without inconvenience. I remember standing in the kitchen rereading those words as the electric kettle hummed behind me. The early morning light filtered through the window, and everything felt surreal. Like my parents were suddenly strangers. I thought about all the years Claire had spent trying to connect with them, all the time she put in effort that was never fully acknowledged. To have all of that dismissed in a single message felt like a punch to the chest. When Claire walked into the kitchen, still half asleep, and asked what I was doing awake so early, I could not bring myself to show her the message right away. It felt too cruel to drop on her without preparing myself first. Instead, I just hugged her tighter than usual and told her I loved her. She looked confused but did not question it. That morning after she left for work, I sat at the table for nearly an hour, staring at the message and thinking about how this family had managed to make everything feel smaller, colder, and more conditional than I ever expected. That was when I began searching for alternate vacations, something that would make Claire feel wanted rather than tolerated. But while I thought I was acting silently and invisibly, I forgot one very important detail. My parents' credit card alerts, the ones they used to monitor the family trip expenses, the ones that pinged their phones every time a charge occurred. They were about to discover what I had done long before I ever intended to tell them. And when they did, everything that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface was going to boil over. I did not hear anything from my parents for almost a full day after the credit card alerts must have hit their phones. I kept waiting for a message or a passive-aggressive comment in our family group chat, but there was only silence. For a moment, I thought maybe they had not checked their phones or maybe the alerts had been buried under other notifications. I tried to enjoy the quiet, but it felt like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing the pressure was building around me. By the following morning, the calm snapped. I woke up to 12 missed calls from my mother, 3 from my father, and 1 from Aaron. That was when I realized the storm had already arrived while I was sleeping. Claire was still in bed, turned away from me, breathing softly. I sat up quietly and slipped out of the room, shutting the door behind me before listening to the first voicemail. My mother's voice was sharp with disbelief, the kind she used when she felt challenged. She demanded to know why the resort had emailed her about new reservations and why her card had been billed for thousands of euros outside the family booking. She said she hoped it was a mistake, but the way she said it told me she was already certain it was not. The next voicemail was even more pointed. She accused me of sabotaging the family trip, of wasting money, of overreacting to something she claimed had been taken out of context. I listened to all of them while pacing the hallway, my chest burning hotter with each one. Not a single message mentioned Claire. Not one even acknowledged the reason I made the new booking in the first place. It was as if my parents had decided that the events leading up to this moment simply did not count. My father's messages were calmer but colder. He repeated that this trip was tradition, that the arrangements had been set, that I had no right to go behind their backs. Then he said something that finally snapped whatever patience I had left. He said that Claire had no reason to feel slighted because she knew from the beginning that family events followed family rules. He said that bringing in outsiders was always complicated. Outsiders. That was the word that made everything clear. By the time I finished listening, my phone buzzed again. It was a long message from Aaron. Unlike my parents, he at least tried to sound understanding, but it still carried that same patronizing tone. He said he was sorry Claire felt left out, but that she should not take things so personally. He said Leela was new and exciting, and that our parents were simply charmed by her. He told me to cancel the separate booking and come back to the original plan before things got blown out of proportion. I stared at the words until the screen dimmed, then set the phone on the counter without responding. The house was quiet except for the sound of Claire making coffee in the kitchen. When I walked in, she smiled at me sleepily, completely unaware of what had happened in the last 20 minutes. She asked if everything was okay. I almost lied. I almost said I was fine just to spare her the pain, but I knew that would only postpone the emotional hit. So I pulled out a chair for her and told her to sit down. I sat across from her and told her everything in one long breath, from the alerts to the voicemails to the word that was still echoing in my head. She did not react the way I expected. I thought she would cry or shrink under the weight of it, but instead she just sat there with this deep, tired sadness in her eyes, the kind that settles after too many small cuts finally connect. She said she had always known she was never going to be enough for my parents. She said she had hoped she was wrong, but now she finally understood that it was not about anything she did or did not do. It was simply who she was. I told her that she was enough for me. I told her that she was more than enough. When I said that, she smiled in a way that almost broke me. She asked if I regretted booking the separate vacation. I told her no, not even for a second. Later that afternoon, my parents finally sent a long message asking me to call them. I ignored it. Instead, I sat down with Claire and we started planning our own trip. We chose dates, picked activities, and found a place that had a private balcony overlooking the water. For the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely excited. The tension in her shoulders loosened, and she laughed at one point, a real laugh, the kind that reached her eyes. But the peace did not last long. Around dinner time, my parents showed up at our house without warning. I heard the knock and knew immediately who it was. Claire and I exchanged a glance, and she told me she would go upstairs so I could talk to them without her feeling like a burden. I stopped her. I told her she had every right to stay. But she insisted she did not want to give them another excuse to blame her, so she slipped upstairs quietly. I opened the door to see my mother standing with her arms crossed, and my father slightly behind her looking stern. They walked in without waiting for an invitation. My mother started lecturing me immediately. She talked about respect, about tradition, about how families needed order. She talked about how I had embarrassed them and how I clearly did not understand how these trips were supposed to work, but she never once said anything about Claire being hurt. So I finally asked the question they kept dancing around in all their messages. Why was Leela considered family enough after 3 weeks? But Claire was not after 6 years. My mother hesitated just for a second. Then she looked me straight in the eye and said that Leela fit better. She said she was charming, sociable, and easy to include. She said Claire was too reserved and did not participate enough. She said Claire always seemed uncomfortable, so they assumed she did not enjoy coming anyway. It took everything in me not to start shouting. I told them Claire was only uncomfortable because they never made space for her. that they talked over her, ignored her contributions, and made her feel like a guest instead of someone who belonged. I told them that her quietness was not a flaw, it was who she was, and that I loved her for it. My mother dismissed that with a wave of her hand. My father said I was exaggerating. They said things had simply changed over the years and that some people blended better than others. It was the final confirmation I needed. They had no intention of treating Claire as family. Not now, not ever. I asked them to leave. They did not take it well. My parents eventually stepped outside after I insisted a second time, but not before my mother gave me one final look that said she believed I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a long moment, listening to the sound of their car starting. Only when the engine faded down the street did I finally let myself breathe. When I turned around, Claire was standing at the top of the stairs, her hands gripping the railing. She had heard enough to know what happened. Her eyes were glossy, but she still tried to smile as she asked if I was okay. I walked up to her and wrapped my arms around her, feeling her whole body stiffen at first, then soften as she buried her face against my shoulder. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say that would not fall apart the moment it left our mouths. For the next few days, the silence from my parents was louder than any argument could have been. They did not call. They did not message. Even the family group chat, which was usually full of random updates and pictures from my cousins, went quiet around us. It felt like everyone had received some unspoken instruction not to reach out. I knew my parents had likely told their version of the story already, one that painted me as impulsive and ungrateful and overly dramatic. I knew how these things usually went. But surprisingly, Aaron reached out first. He sent a short message asking if we could talk. I hesitated because I was not sure whether I had the emotional energy left to deal with my brother's attempts at smoothing things over or offering advice no one had asked for. But I also knew that if I did not say anything now, the gap between us might solidify into something we could not repair. So I invited him over the next evening. When he arrived, he looked uncomfortable, like he was not completely sure which side he was supposed to be on. He walked in quietly, glanced around the living room, and sat down on the edge of the couch as if he was afraid of leaving an impression on the cushions. Claire stayed upstairs, giving us space, though I knew she was listening closely. He took a long moment before speaking. He said he had talked to our parents. He said they were upset but also confused about why the vacation plans mattered so much. He said they felt blindsided. I let him finish, then I told him everything they had said in my living room, especially the part about Claire not blending well enough and Leela being more suitable for the family dynamic. I watched his face carefully, waiting to see whether he would defend them or pretend it was not as harsh as it sounded. But instead, he sighed and rubbed his eyes. He admitted that our parents had always had a habit of deciding who fit their mold and who did not. He said he had noticed it, but he had never thought about how deeply it cut for the people on the outside of that mold. He admitted he should have spoken up earlier when he saw how Claire was treated. And then he surprised me. He apologized, not on their behalf, but on his own. It did not fix anything, but it made something heavy loosen in my chest. He said he would talk to them again and try to make them understand, but he warned me not to expect a miracle. Our parents were set in their ways, and change was not something they embraced easily, especially when it came to traditions they believed defined the family. I told him I appreciated the honesty. I also told him that I was done waiting for them to accept Claire on their terms. The vacation we booked was for us, not for them. After he left, I went upstairs to find Claire sitting on the bed, scrolling through pictures of beaches and restaurants near the resort we had picked. She looked up and asked how it went. I told her the truth. I told her that Aaron understood more than I expected. She nodded, but her expression remained cautious, as if she was afraid to hope for too much. I sat next to her and leaned against her shoulder. She leaned back without hesitation. Over the next week, the distance between us and my parents turned into something solid. They sent one message, a long one, saying they hoped I would reconsider and claiming they never meant to hurt anyone. They insisted everything had been a misunderstanding, but they never addressed the real issue. They never acknowledged the words that had cut the deepest. They never apologized to Claire. It was all phrased in a way that avoided responsibility, like a cloud of words meant to look like clarity but only creating fog. I wrote back one final time. I told them we were keeping our separate trip. I told them we loved them, but would not participate in a tradition that excluded someone who was part of my life and my family. I told them that if they ever wanted to talk honestly about what happened, I would be here. But until then, I needed space. They never responded. When the day of the vacation finally arrived, Claire and I packed our bags and drove to the airport early in the morning. The sky was pale blue, and the air had that crisp feeling that always comes before a long day of travel. Claire rested her head against the window during the drive, and every so often she would reach over and squeeze my hand gently, like she was grounding both of us. The resort was even more beautiful in person than the pictures. Our room had a balcony that overlooked the ocean, and when we opened the door, warm air rushed in carrying the scent of salt and sunlight. Claire walked out to the railing, her hair lifting slightly in the breeze, and I watched her take everything in with a quiet awe that made me forget every stress that had led us here. We spent the next days exploring, swimming, eating too much, sleeping in, and talking about our future with a freedom I had not felt in years. For the first time, there was no pressure to perform or fit into someone else's expectation of what family should look like. It was just us, and it was enough. One evening, while we sat on the beach watching the sun disappear behind the water, Claire turned to me with a soft expression. She said she felt like she could finally breathe. She said she was glad I chose this with her. I told her I would choose her every time. By the time we flew home, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Traditions are only worth keeping when they hold everyone with care. The moment they start cutting people out, they stop being traditions and become cages. And I was done living inside a cage built by someone else. Claire was my family, and this time I chose her openly, fully, and without apology.